Have you ever thought about killing someone? Well, I hope not. But why? Because it causes culpable homicide. What's culpable homicide?
Yeah. Culpable homicide is intentionally causing the death of another or intentionally inflicting harm that you know will cause their death if you're not acting in self-defense or in this or defense of another defined by the law. In Canada, under Section 2225 of the Criminal Code, a person commits culpable homicide when he causes the death of a human being by means of an unlawful act, by criminal negligence, by causing the victim, by threats or fear of violence, or by deception to do anything that causes their death, or by willfully frightening the victim in case of a child or a sick person. So there are 4 types of homicide. There is first-degree murder. So if you are convicted of first-degree murder, you face a sentence of life imprisonment with no chance of parole for 25 years. If you are between 12 and 17 years of age at the time you were charged with murder, the maximum sentence is 10 years for first degree. Then there's second-degree murder. If you're convicted of second-degree murder, you will face a sentence of life imprisonment with no chance of parole for 10 to 25 years, and parole eligibility will be decided by a judge. The criminal code states that if you have been convicted of murder in the past, you must serve the maximum 25 years before you can be considered for release. And if you were between 12 and 17 years old at the time you were charged with second-degree murder, the maximum sentence is 7 years according to Section 42(1)(q) of the Youth Criminal Act. Then there's manslaughter without a firearm. Manslaughter doesn't have a minimum penalty. Still, it can lead to a maximum life sentence with parole eligibility after 7 years, subject to the judge's discretion to delay eligibility for up to 10 years under Section 743.6 of the code. And if a firearm is involved in the offense, you can be sentenced to a minimum of 4 years in prison with parole eligibility after serving 1/3 of the sentence. And then infanticide, there's no minimum penalty for infanticide. The maximum jail term is 5 years, although the average sentence is about 18 months. En Colombia, el artículo 109 del Código Penal estipula cuál es la sanción aplicable a ese delito. El que por culpa matare a otro incurrirá en prisión de 13 a 25 años y multa de 26.66 a 150 salarios mínimos legales mensuales vigentes.
What does that mean?
That means Article 109 of the Colombian Criminal Code stipulates the punishment applicable to this offense. Anyone who by fault kills another shall incur imprisonment from 13 to 25 years and a fine of 26.66 to 150 current legal monthly minimum wages. When it comes to minors who are older than 14 years old and younger than 18, they could get the minimum sentence for youths of 6 years or more. In law 1098 of 2006 states that teenagers of the ages of 14 to 16 years of age can only be sent to jail for homicide, kidnapping, and extortion. En Argentina, artículo 69 se aplicará reclusión o prisión de 8 a 20 años al que matara a otro. That sounded very Italian. Artículo 80 se impondrá reclusión perpetua o prisión perpetua al que matara a su ascendiente, descendiente o cónyuge, sabiendo que no son, al que matara a otro para preparar, facilitar, consumar u ocultar otro delito, para asegurar sus resultados o de impunidad para sí o para sus cooperadores o para no saber obtenido el resultado que se propuso al intentar el otro hecho punible. I tried to say that in an Argentine accent. Didn't work out. I need to work on my accent.
What does that mean?
Criminal Code says that imprisonment for 8 to 25 years shall apply to anyone who kills another. And then Article 80 serves kind of as like an aggravating factor law, and it states that life imprisonment shall be imposed to anyone who kills their ascendant, descendant, or spouse with no possibility of parole. The purpose. So seeing as these 3 countries are part of the United Nations, they do uphold the right for human life very highly. So they kind of have the purpose of their legislation in common. And the culpable homicide legislations are kind of there to establish a legal framework for addressing homicides that result from carelessness, negligence, and recklessness. And the factors that influence this legislation can come from societal values, cultural norms, legal principles, and the need for justice, as well as some like religious influence to it. Seeing as these countries are mainly Christian countries and we all follow the 10 Commandments, this law is kind of like an agreement that church and state can come to, in which it highlights the 6th commandment of thou shalt not kill and the respect for human life. Additionally, another thing that these countries have in common is the perspective on aggravating and mitigating factors. So when it comes to sentencing the sentencing. All these countries' judges, and in some cases like Canada, the juries look beyond the crime when they're deciding on a sentencing. So for example, aggravating factors among this crime in these countries include the use of violence or weapons, the vulnerability of the victim, especially if it's a child, the level of planning and premeditation involved in the offense, and the impact on the victim or the community, in any prior criminal record of the offender. So a mitigating factor can also vary among each case. For instance, in Colombia, no matter how good you are of a person you are, it is very difficult for a Colombian to get their homicide charges to be reduced, specifically when it involves the death of a child or a woman, and especially in femicide cases. And factors such as good behavior, being a student, or having like a higher level of education, as well as your financial status, can really like help you. But again, it's just solely based on the judge's judgment, because there's no jury trials in Colombia. And when homicide is committed against a child, the minimum sentencing is 25 years with no chance of parole, and it is very difficult to reduce the sentencing, especially if more than one child has been affected. In 2020, they tried to approve life imprisonment for child murderers and sex offenders, but it was argued that the 25-year minimum was already very long, and that increasing the sentence or even passing a life imprisonment law for these criminals would violate their human dignity. It could cause irreversible issues in their mental and physical health, like, because who cares about the mental and physical health of the victim and the victim's family? So Argentina's major aggravating factor, as previously mentioned, is their Article 80 in the criminal code, which states that you may face life imprisonment if you kill your parent, your child, or your spouse. And this is something that they have in common with Colombia, not the life imprisonment part, but the aggravating factor. Colombia's criminal code also states that if you kill your parent or your child, you may get the maximum sentence, and the maximum sentence in Colombia is 60 years in prison. So other aggravating factors that Argentina and Colombia have in common include that the homicide has been done as a terrorist act or with terrorist intent, that the person killed is internationally protected or a diplomatic agent, the person is a minor, especially if it's a girl, because you can be charged with femicide, and if the victim was or had been a social worker, a journalist, human rights activist, or a member of a religious or political organization. Also, something that Colombia has is that a major aggravating factor can be if you kill a judge of peace. And judge of peace are specialized judges which judge people who have been part of terrorist groups throughout Colombian history. Because in 2017, the Colombian president signed a peace treaty with these terrorist groups, and they were given like certain benefits, and one of them is that if they were ever to be judged, which one of their things that they said had to be done in order for them to sign this treaty was to never go to prison, but if they were to be judged for something else, they would be judged by a specialized peace judge. So if you kill one of these peace judges in Colombia, that's also an aggravating factor, and you may face up to 60 years in prison.
Infographics and visuals.
Canada.
So here you can see an infographic of homicide in Canada in 2021. I'm going to be talking a little bit about that, and then I'll explain to you how that differs from Canada's homicide in 2022. So nationwide, 788 homicides were reported by the police in 2021 compared to 2020. The national homicide rate increased by 3% to 2.08 homicides per 100,000 population. And gang-related homicides continued to account for nearly a quarter of all homicides in 2021. 2 in 5 victims of homicide were killed by shootings in 2021. According to the data from the past 5 years, homicides by shooting take the longest to solve, and in 2021, 1/4 of the victims, so around 25%, were identified as Indigenous, which is one of Canada's most vulnerable groups when it comes to homicide. And the proportion of women who were killed by their spouse or intimate partner in Canada was approximately 7 times higher than the proportion of men, and it was at 44% and 7% respectively. And the rate of homicides was almost 1.3 times higher in rural communities than in urban areas. So it was at 2.58 versus at 1.97 per 100,000 population, and approximately 1/3 of the victims were identified as racialized persons. And then in 2022, police reported 874 homicides, 78 more than the year before. and the homicide rate was increased by 8%, so from 2.08 homicides per 100,000 population in 2021 to 2.25 homicides per 100,000 population in 2022, and this was the highest rate since 1992. And the national increase was largely the result of homicides in British Columbia, so there are 30 more homicides in British Columbia. In Manitoba, there's 26 more homicides, and Quebec, 20 more homicides. As has been the case historically, provincial homicide rates were the highest in Manitoba, so for 6.24 homicides per 100,000 population, and Saskatchewan 5.94 per 100,000 population. Colombia. Colombia's homicide rate is a little bit higher. It's a little bit higher. 30 times higher, which is like awful. So in 2022, there were approximately 26 homicides per 100,000 inhabitants in the country, which is down from the homicide rate from the previous year, which was 26.8. The homicide rate in Colombia has been stable since 2014, with numbers varying between 24 and 26.8 homicides per 100,000 inhabitants. And this stability came as a result of like terrorist groups in Colombia realizing they were making more money off of drug trafficking and just like sending their drugs to the state than kidnapping people and extortioning their families and then just killing them. And even though Colombia's 26 per 100,000 inhabitants is 13 times higher than Canada's 2.08, this is still so much lower than it was back in the 1990s. And actually, Harvard University released a study where they talked about the roots of violence in Colombia, and they said that in the early 90s, where Pablo Escobar was like killing a lot of people, there was like bombs, also terrorist groups got involved. The rate could like range from 245 to 400 per 100,000 inhabitants. So I guess over the years it has been better, and like I mentioned previously, this has a lot to do because all these terrorist groups, they don't really kidnap and ask for money anymore and kill people. They just kind of get their money and their power through drug trafficking. Argentina. Ta-da! So the homicide rate in Argentina in 2021 was 4.62 per 100,000 inhabitants. But as you can see here, I can't understand, but I'm here to make you understand. Argentina's homicide rate in 2022 was 4.2 per 100,000 inhabitants. And then in 2022, 1,959 homicide cases were registered by the police. And the provinces that you can see in red are the ones where the rate was at its highest. So 11 of the 24 provinces showed an increase in their homicide rates, and the ones that increased the most were Santa Fe with a 43.9% and Misiones with 27.2%. You can see Misiones at the top and then Santa Fe towards the top-ish middle. And then another province that also saw an increase in their homicide rate was Chubut, which is like at the bottom. So the remaining 13 of the 24 provinces in Argentina actually showed a decrease in their homicide rate, with Catamarca, La Rioja, and San Juan being the ones that showed a significant decrease. You can see them towards the end, they're in blue. And then it was also explained that Buenos Aires Provincia, which is like where the capital city of Buenos Aires is located, actually had like the major contribution towards homicide rate decrease in 2022, where they transformed their 39.5% homicide rate to an 11.7% from 2021 to 2022, being the major contributor to homicide justice in the country.
The trials.
So both Colombia and Argentina actually have a legal system that's based on civil law tradition, with a strong emphasis on written laws and codes, while Canada follows a common law system which relies on precedent and judicial decisions. So in the jury system, both Argentina and Colombia actually don't use jury trials. So the punishment of a person who commits a homicide is solely based on the judge, so it's his responsibility to determine the defendant's guilt or innocence. While Canada uses a jury system where a group of ordinary citizens, which is called like jury duty, decides the defendant's fate or punishment, and their verdict must often be unanimous for a conviction. And the burden of proof, so like Canada, Argentina follows the beyond a reasonable doubt standard for the burden of proof in criminal cases, including homicide trials. And the prosecution must prove the defendant's guilt to this high standard, while Colombia typically uses the beyond a doubt standard, which is a lower burden of proof compared to Canadian and Argentine standards. And the pretrial decision or detention practices in Argentina may be more similar to those in Colombia, where it is relatively common. So judges often order pre-trial detention when there is a risk that the accused may not appear in court or may pose danger to society, which in a lot of cases, it's like very often, like it's not rare for the accused to remain under police detention until their trial comes. And in Canada, pre-trial detention is typically reserved for cases where there's a significant risk of flight or danger to the community, with a greater emphasis on bail as an option. Then Argentina, like Canada, has a range of possible sentences for homicide, including imprisonment. Both Canada and Argentina have the life imprisonment option for homicide cases, and sentencing can vary depending on the specific circumstances of the case and the judge's discretion. This is also something they have in common with Colombia, where the judge's discretion is one of the top priorities, and a lot of the decisions just solely rely on the judge. And restorative justice and reconciliation processes may not be as commonly used in Argentina as they are in Colombia. And then as for legal procedures, the legal procedures in Argentina may be more in line with a civil law inquisitorial system, where the judges play a more active role in investigating and examining evidence, which is very similar to Colombia. There's actually a 45-day period between the accused's arrest and their trial, where in these 45 days the prosecution has to present all the evidence and the judge has this time to heavily examine it on their own. While in Canada, the trial process follows a common law adversarial model with a more significant role for legal representatives and the parties involved in presenting evidence and making their own arguments. And at the end of something they all have in common is that at the end of the trial, they all can have their closing statements, both defense, prosecution, or defense and the crown.
The vulnerable?
So Canada's most vulnerable group when it comes to homicide is Indigenous women, as they're at an elevated risk of homicide. For the last 30 or so years, both the United States and Canada have suffered from an epidemic of the missing and the killing of many of their Indigenous women. Based on 15 years of homicide survey data that was taken from 2001 and 2015, homicide rates for Indigenous women and girls were approximately 6 times higher than rates for non-Indigenous women and girls. This was at around for the Indigenous women, it was 48.2 per million population, and for non-Indigenous women and girls, it was 8.2 per million population. Canada's most vulnerable is actually a bit different than Canada's. So Colombia's most vulnerable groups of people that are mostly affected by homicide are people from low-income backgrounds who live in poor neighborhoods of their respective cities. So unfortunately, a lot of main cities in Colombia deal with gangs, and when these gangs are trying to confront each other and there's a fight, they often use a lot of weapons, things like guns, among others. And when they confront each other, maybe they shoot and they don't see, or they try to hide, there's a lot of missing bullets, and unfortunately a lot of people who have nothing to do with the conflict end up dead due to a missing bullet. And actually, in 2018, 252 cases of lost bullet incidents were registered, in which 47 people died. In 2000, in 205 were hurt. Among them, a famous Colombian singer. He was pretty famous in Colombia and a couple like Latin American countries. He was unfortunately victim of a lost bullet. Argentina has a huge problem dealing with different criminal gangs throughout their country, and it was identified by the United Nations Office of Drugs and Crime that young men are especially at risk, with a rate of homicides for men between the ages of 18 to 19 years old that is estimated to be 46 per 100,000 inhabitants. And a study ran by the World Bank revealed that Latin America suffers 30% more homicides than any other part of the world. And this is due to the rise of different criminal organizations and the corruption present throughout the governments and police departments. So criminal organizations, like, they seek young people, especially young people from poor neighborhoods, so young men, and they always offer the money. And usually the leaders of these organizations make them do like the dirty work and the dangerous part of the work that could involve weapons, and it's so dangerous that there could be a higher risk of their death in exchange for money, so they can help their families. Seeing as these people are poor, they need the help, and the danger they put themselves in is what causes most cases of homicide in Argentina, Colombia, and most Latin American countries. International stance. So neither Canada nor Argentina have had like major events and conflicts regarding homicide in which like international organizations have had to step in, such as like the UN or Interpol or ICC and all these things. But Colombia has, and like I previously mentioned, all these three countries that I've been talking about are part of the United Nations and have implemented the Universal Declaration of Human Rights into their human rights laws. So during some of Colombia's most violent times, in which we were fighting Las FARC, which was this like terrorist group which affected thousands and thousands of families all throughout Colombia. During military attacks and stuff like that against this terrorist group, the UN had to intervene a lot, because the terrorists would be caught by surprise in the middle of the night, and hundreds of them would die within a couple hours. And because the United Nations does appreciate the right of life, and that's one of the first human rights in the Universal Declaration, they have to come and say, like, I understand it's a terrorist group, but you cannot kill this many people at once. And not only do they intervene for this group, but they also intervene for the other side. So when a lot of kids were taken away from their families, because Las FARC, which is the terrorist group I'm talking about, they would just go to like very vulnerable little cities or villages in some way in Colombia. They would just tell kids, like, come with us. Kids as young as 8 years old, come with us, and if you don't come with us, we will kill all your family and kill you. So all these children would go with them, and they would lose all their family, they wouldn't see them again, and they would be given a gun and say, here's how you kill, here's how you kidnap, here's how you do all these illegal things, and they'll never see their families again, and this is how their life would go. So the UN had to step in multiple occasions and try to negotiate with this terrorist group about like the prevention of taking children and like not killing families and burning whole villages. So there was an intervention from like the international stance. Like a lot of countries that were part of the United Nations agreed to send multiple groups and resources to Colombia to help all these families affected. The United States had donated millions and millions of dollars to Colombia during this time of conflict. Many different countries with like advanced economy and resources did intervene during Colombia's most violent times. My opinion. I think the country with the most effective law is Canada. I don't know if it's like a cultural aspect of it or it is truly a legal aspect from it, but you can kind of see that the homicide rates are way lower in Canada than they are for Colombia and Argentina. Like even Argentina, who had its like all-time historically lowest homicide rate, was still twice I don't know, twice as bad as Canada's. And Canada has like a very strict rules. Like it's very rare for these sentences to be lowered, unlike Colombia, who's like always lowering sentences based on factors that may not even be mitigating factors for this specific offense. I really like how there's like if it's first degree murder and second degree murder, there's like no chance of parole until you've done these specific, you've gone through these specific sentences of like 10 or 25 years. I think it's like very effective. Something that I also I think is very effective, especially when it comes like in the trial process, is the jury. Neither Colombia nor Argentina have jury duty, and they don't have a jury to maybe set a sentence for the accused. And I feel like the jury adds like that's more of a humane perspective to the case than any like lawyer could add to it, because a lawyer will always look at it and a judge will always look at it from a legal perspective, because they've studied this for years and years in order to achieve their position, which rightfully so they deserve it. But I do believe that the jury adds like a more humane perspective to it. They're able to see a case from a personal perspective. A lot of them are able to put themselves in the victim's shoes, in the victim family's shoes, and they're able to sentence a person based on what they think they truly deserve based on their the accused person's actions. So I think that's a very good thing. It's also like weird. I feel like the jury is something that I personally really like, and I feel like it should be implemented in Colombian and Argentinian justice systems. I again more speak about it from the Colombian perspective. Like Colombia is a country that has been through a lot of violence and continues to have a great deal of violence, specifically from what we see in the homicide rates. In Colombia, they were 26 per every 100,000, while Argentina's was 4.2, while Canada's was 2.25. I think Colombians, because of our history with violence, would have so much more to say and to give to the justice system when it comes to sentencing people who have committed homicide towards others, especially vulnerable children and women. But yeah, I think Canada has the most effective one, and I think Canada's effective law is the reason why they have the lowest homicide rate between the three nations I chose. Thank you for watching. Please give me a good grade. I tried. This assignment stressed me out a lot, and I feel like I have like 18 pages of research, but it's all like very confusing. But I hope you liked it, and I hope you like my Spanish.